301. Talk to William Brown. That evening, William, who had nearly set Scott up, contacted him through the little fireplace. Scott was still in the room of requirement when the green flames flared and a voice came through. "I'm not asking why you did that, William." Scott watched the green fire dance. "Did you see Hagrid today? Are you still going to be his defense lawyer?" Before William could answer, Scott went on, "You'd better keep your promise about those thestrals you took." He pressed, "Hagrid domesticated them. In all of Britain, only Hagrid can domesticate thestrals." "Oh, isn't it rare to hear you string so many words together, Scott? You sound a bit angry." William's smile was almost audible. "I wasn't involved in that. I've been in London getting ready for university." "Really? You're actually sitting university exams?" Scott smiled. "It's funny timing. Slytherin's green robes just happens to need a barrister from Cambridge fluent in Muggle law." "We don't call ourselves the Green Robes," William said, a little helplessly. Scott feigned surprise. "Then what do people call you? Those Death Eaters had a name that carried weight." "We're already known," William said. "Besides, Miss Slytherin's name is a banner." "Ah, a surname as a banner," Scott said dryly. "So now you're into pure-blood vanity?" William was unruffled. "Miss Slytherin doesn't care about blood purity. She judges true talent." "She values you, then," Scott said. "You don't seem as obsessed with ranks as the Death Eaters," Scott noted. "I haven't even heard you say Lord." "Of course not," William replied. "Miss Slytherin dislikes Voldemort's methods." "So what does your organization actually want?" Scott asked. "Medea wanted me to join, but never explained her ideals." "I think you already understand," William began. "No, I don't," Scott cut in, firmly. William's tone darkened a little. "Miss Slytherin wants wizards to be competitive with Muggles. Muggle technology is advancing faster and faster." He paused, letting Scott consider, then continued. "She believes wizards have grown complacent. One day Muggles could discover us, and our living space could be squeezed away." "You want to start a war with Muggles?" Scott asked. "Your parents are Muggles, aren't they, William?" "No, Miss Slytherin doesn't want a war like Grindelwald's," William said. "She just wants to ensure wizards aren't left behind by technological progress." He sounded earnest. "Maybe one day there will be a better, more open way to coexist with Muggles. I'm preparing for that, so I'm taking university exams." William laughed. "You're right. Maybe we'll need a Cambridge-educated barrister who knows Muggle law someday." "All very grand," Scott said, his tone teasing. "Miss Slytherin is thinking about all wizards everywhere." "That's exactly it. So why don't you join us, Scott?" "Sorry, I can't buy that." Scott's voice hardened. "That woman sacrificed 2 wizards right in front of me." "No," William began. Scott cut him off. "Do you remember Lockhart? Their bodies melted like candles." William tried again, but Scott pushed on. "She threatened me today. If I can't help her find Voldemort's Horcrux, she'll sacrifice more wizards." Scott's laugh was cold. "She doesn't value other wizards' lives. She sees them as livestock. How can someone like that be working for the future of wizards? Sorry, I find that ridiculous." "Miss Slytherin wouldn't do that," William snapped, louder than he meant to. Then, realizing Scott wasn't interrupting, he drew his breath and lowered his voice. "She was joking with you. She wouldn't kill people arbitrarily." "And Lockhart and Yaxley?" Scott asked. "That was a special case." William insisted. "If they hadn't been removed, Miss Slytherin couldn't have gotten away from Dumbledore. Besides, both Lockhart and Yaxley were criminals." Scott smiled, but the amusement had left him. If Medea were reasonable, she wouldn't be rationalizing like that. William was quiet for a moment. "All right, maybe there are things about her I don't understand." Scott felt a flicker of pity. William was bright. He shouldn't be so easily convinced, but clearly he was. And William probably couldn't understand Scott's reluctance either. "Why are you resisting, Scott?" William asked, genuinely puzzled. "Even if you don't want to join, helping Miss Slytherin defeat Voldemort is a good thing." "I don't mean to harm you," Scott said lightly. Scott's answer was non-committal. William pressed on. "Voldemort stands for pure blood supremacy. We're both from Muggle families. You must see that's against everything we believe." "I do," Scott agreed. "Then why refuse to help? Voldemort's disappearance would be good for everyone." "You're right," Scott said softly, "but I can't do it. I don't have the ability to find a Horcrux." He ended the flow abruptly. After all that probing and talk, he was tired. William would never understand that while Voldemort's fall would be a good thing, Medea's full recovery was not. If a good outcome comes tied to something worse, sometimes it's better to keep two halves, half good, half bad, than to trade everything for a single complete victory. 302. Shackles, Devil, Good Night. Do you think Medea will really go around harming other wizards as wantonly as she said? Scott asked his mentor as he left the room of requirement. No, the Ravenclaw in the painting smiled. That would make her a common enemy of the entire magical world. Scott nodded. William's words had shown that Medea was already recruiting for the Green Robbers by speaking to ideals. Whether those ideals were sincere or not, they could move many wizards the way they had moved people like William. Katie Shafiq, the Flu Network administration employee who had once written to him, was a half-blood and had written about Medea with reverence. If principles like, "For the future of wizards," had become the Green Robbers' creed, the leader couldn't be the first to betray them. Scott murmured, Medea used a set of beautiful ideals to win people over, and in doing so she put shackles on herself. He thought of how celebrities, in his previous life, carefully crafted public personas. A good image drew followers, but when it collapsed, the fallout was brutal. The presence of stated ideals suggested Medea might not be headed down the outright terrorist path like Lord Voldemort. Her attacks on the Merlin Order stronghold and Edinburgh Castle certainly looked like terrorism, but she could later try to justify or clean things up. What worried Scott was something else. Medea's infiltration of the ministry couldn't have been as simple as one rogue Flu Network clerk. She'd had the Green Robbers occupying Edinburgh Castle for almost a week, yet the ministry hadn't intervened directly. The Daily Prophet had only run bland official statements. No one died in this incident, including Muggles. Researchers from the Department of Mysteries are studying the magical defenses of Edinburgh Castle, and a team of elite aurors is permanently stationed in Edinburgh, always on high alert. How this would end was anyone's guess. Ravenclaw in the painting added, also, Medea can only truly and fully revive by sacrificing the complete soul of a direct bloodline descendant. Then why did she sacrifice those two wizards before leaving Hogwarts? Scott pressed. Ravenclaw explained, I think the situation was urgent then. She could only snatch a little vitality that way to transform her body. Scott nodded. She had been facing Dumbledore at the time. The portrait continued, but that won't last. Without continuous replenishment, her body will degenerate back into a doll. In other words, if she can't obtain Voldemort's complete soul, she could actually become a man-eating demon, Scott said, surprised. He had thought Medea's talk about sacrificing other wizards was bluster. She won't take that step unless she has no choice, Ravenclaw said. As I said, it would make her the enemy of the whole magical community. Besides, she still has a chance to reunite with Voldemort's main soul. But, Scott remembered, the diadem was purified by the real you. Ravenclaw smiled. To avoid destroying the diadem's function, I performed a gentle purification. I expelled the soul fragments, not annihilated them. Then where did they go? Scott asked. They followed the pull of their original bond and returned to Voldemort's main soul, Ravenclaw replied. Scott left the room of requirement with a heavy heart. After turning down a few corridors, a crow swooped in through an open window and landed lightly on his shoulder. Lambo. Scott stroked its feathers and moved off the 8th floor, finally slipping into an empty classroom on the 3rd floor. He sealed the room with protective and soundproofing charms, then spoke to Lambo. Did you go to the 3 broomsticks today? Did anything happen at William and Hagrid's meeting? No, everything's normal, the crow answered. Lambo hopped from Scott's shoulder onto the old desk and looked up. I came to tell you the crows flew back to Scotland from Northern Europe today. They found Durmstrang Institute. Durmstrang? Scott tapped the desk and smiled. So Elijah Caro and his cousin Caitlin Roll are really studying there now? It's true. I sent a few crows that had seen them back north. They remembered their faces, Lambo said. Scott laughed. Those crows did well. I didn't expect them to actually find Durmstrang. I must thank them. Lambo snorted. You do realize they can't read or understand human speech, right? Of course I know, Scott said, and it's really your cleverness that got them to do it. That's more like it, Lambo preened. Scott piled on the flattery. Honestly, I'd be lost without you. What would I do without your help? Hey, Lambeau eyed him. Are you trying to make me go to Northern Europe? That's a bit far. No, Scott said. He couldn't let Lambeau stray too far. Without the flock and without Lambeau to lead and translate their observations, a great many things would be inconvenient. So what now? If I remember right, Caro once tried to kill you. Are you going to get revenge? There's no rush, Scott murmured as he stroked Lambeau again. Now that Durmstrang's been found, there will be opportunities. Priorities mattered. Dealing with Medea came first. Lambeau added, also, the crows didn't see anything unusual about the care of magical creatures assistant professor. That's good, Scott said. Keep watching her. No problem. She lives in the Forbidden Forest anyway. I'll go back to the forest now. Lambeau stretched its wings. Scott stood, opened the classroom window, and watched the crow slip into the night. Good night, Scott. Lambeau called from the darkness before it faded away. Scott lingered at the window a moment, then finished dismantling the charms he'd set and left the room. 303. The Dark Lord may need help. A new week began. On Monday morning, Scott took his books and went with his roommates to the Great Hall for breakfast. This Saturday is our first match of the term, Roger said to him. Against Gryffindor, Eddie added. And it's the first time our tactical advisory group will be involved in a game. I've already gathered intelligence on the opponents, and the others have started drawing up strategies. Both of them turned to look at Scott as they spoke. Even Milton chimed in. Don't overdo it, Scott. It's good to relax and watch a match sometimes. All right, I know. Scott raised his hands in mock surrender. I'll go watch on Saturday. His roommates finally relaxed into satisfied smiles. As they sat down, Scott cast a glance toward the Gryffindor table. What are you staring at? Eddie, ever the gossip hound, asked immediately. Scott gave him an exasperated look. Nothing. He ignored Eddie's curious eyes and began to eat. Scott actually wanted to see if Harry had arrived. He had come to realize he could learn about Voldemort's situation indirectly through Harry. There seemed to be an invisible link between them. In the original timeline, after Peter Pettigrew found Voldemort and helped him regain some power, Harry started seeing him in dreams. When Voldemort eventually returned to full strength, that connection deepened. Harry even dreamed about Nagini attacking Arthur Weasley. Scott moved silently, connecting his magic to the little Harry Potter doll on Harry's backpack. It was a red chibi charm, the get-well gift Scott had given him. From then on, whenever Harry said the name Lord Voldemort, the doll would record it, and when Scott approached, the doll could replay those conversations to him. He did all of this stealthily so no one noticed. An owl arrived with that morning's daily prophet. After scanning it, students around the hall began to mock the ministry's incompetence and inaction. Look at today's headline, Operation to Reclaim Edinburgh Castle, Department of Mysteries research progressing smoothly, major breakthrough expected soon. They've run that line more than once, someone said. That means they still haven't launched a proper operation, another scoffed. I bet they're completely stumped, someone else added. People no longer trusted the paper's promised breakthroughs. They thought the ministry was trying to fool them. Are they just going to let those people keep Edinburgh Castle indefinitely? Maybe they can't get past whatever protective magic's around it. The Department of Mysteries has been studying this for a week. Why not call Dumbledore? Scott kept eating and watched the doors. Not long after, Harry, Ron, and Hermione rushed in. He spotted the small red doll dangling from Harry's backpack, the little Harry toy he'd given him, but didn't turn his head. His hidden magic had already linked to the charm. Roger and Eddie were talking about the paper when Eddie suddenly cried out, "He's dead!" What happened? Scott asked. It's Peter Pettigrew, Eddie said, handing the prophet to Scott. The ministry announced Pettigrew was found in Azkaban. Scott took the paper. The notice was only a brief corner item. Peter Pettigrew confirmed dead, cause of death listed as natural causes. Scott frowned at the bland conclusion. Eddie grinned. Surprised? I thought maybe he'd gotten the Dementor's kiss. From the Gryffindor table came the Weasley twins' dramatic cry. Oh, Merlin, Ron, your Scabbers is dead. Poor Ron, you loved him so much. Ron's indignant shouting answered, Shut up, Fred, George. Scott put the newspaper aside and kept eating. He didn't buy natural causes. He half suspected Snape. Perhaps Snape had finally found a way to make Pettigrew die that looked natural. Although Snape had been stopped by Dumbledore in that attempt, Scott felt the potion's master wouldn't have given up. A potion could make a wizard appear to die of natural causes. That thought was idle speculation. A few more days passed, and the Ministry's operation to take back Edinburgh Castle showed no real progress. Harry hadn't provided any feedback either. Perhaps Voldemort still hadn't regained enough strength. On Saturday morning, Scott sat in the noisy stands, still turning it over in his mind. Voldemort at this point was just a remnant of a soul, like a wandering ghost with little power. He was probably focused on avoiding Medea and had no reason to reveal himself until he was stronger. Madam Hooch's whistle blew. The Quidditch match began. Scott watched the players fly, but his thoughts stayed on Voldemort. The fallen Dark Lord needed help. In the original story, it was Pettigrew who went into the Albanian forest and found Voldemort's remnant, helping him create a temporary infant body and restoring some of his power. Now that Pettigrew was dead, Scott thought Voldemort needed a different loyal subordinate, Barty Crouch Jr. Barty Crouch Jr. was the son of a high-ranking Ministry official, Barty Crouch, who headed international magical cooperation and had previously led the Legal Enforcement Squad. The scandal of a senior Ministry official prosecuting Death Eaters while his own son was one ruined Crouch's political career. Barty Crouch Jr. had been fanatically loyal to Voldemort. After the Dark Lord's fall, Crouch Jr. and several other Death Eaters had tortured the Longbottoms with the Cruciatus to extract information, driving the couple insane. The public believed the young fanatic had been sentenced to life in Azkaban and later died there. Scott, knowing more of the original plot, knew the truth. Barty Crouch Jr. had not died. His mother had saved him. She had begged her husband to swap places using Polyjuice Potion to take on her son's appearance and die in Azkaban in his stead, while the real Barty Crouch Jr. assumed his mother's guise and was brought home. When Crouch Sr. finally had his son back, he discovered the fanaticism hadn't changed. He used Imperius to keep his son confined, hid him under an invisibility cloak, and had him guarded by a house elf. Scott weighed that history as the match unfolded before him. If Pettigrew was really gone, someone like Barty Crouch Jr., fanatic, resourceful, and personally connected to the Ministry, could be exactly the kind of aid Voldemort would need to recover. Since Lord Voldemort needed a helper, he would be given one, Scott thought. Having made up his mind, he finally started watching the game properly. It was obvious to anyone watching that Ravenclaw's raw strength didn't match Gryffindor's. The Seekers were a clear example. Chang's flying and broom work were no match for Harry's. Ravenclaw had clearly adjusted formation and tactics during the match, but without enough practice, the changes hadn't paid off. "Oh, damn! Gryffindor scored again!" Eddie shouted beside Scott. "Come on, Roger! Fly faster, Roger!" Roger, high on his broom, couldn't hear Eddie. He was fighting to steer the quaffle through a ring of Gryffindor players, ducking Angelina's charge, avoiding a bludger George had sent his way, and with Chambers covering him, he drove toward the goal, guarded by Wood. "Charge! Charge! Charge!" Eddie almost went hoarse. Lee Jordan's commentary crackled over the speakers in his usual breathless, rhythmic style. Davies throws, he throws, Wood intercepts, watch the bludger, oh goal! Wood couldn't stop it, he was almost taken out by a bludger. Ravenclaw's beater set that one up. A roar went up from the Ravenclaw stands. Eddie and Milton, sitting beside Scott, waved their small blue flags wildly. The match ran on through the afternoon. By the time two teams had been playing for hours and everyone had missed lunch, players were getting tired. At 2:45 p.m., Harry finally caught the golden snitch, ending a hard-fought game. Ravenclaw lost, 190 to 350. Scott climbed down from the stands with the Ravenclaws and, with Eddie's help, supported a tired Roger as he made his way back toward the Great Hall. Roger wasn't too put out by the loss. "The tactical advisory group is helping," he kept saying. "We just need a few more matches to get our lineup in sync. We'll make them regret underestimating us." After a meal and a bit of recovery, the Quidditch team and the tactical advisory group gathered in the common room to review the game. Scott didn't join the debrief. Instead, he slipped back out of Ravenclaw Tower and headed for the edge of the Forbidden Forest. A black shape burst out of the trees. Lambo, quick as ever, flew to perch nearby. Scott leaned against a big trunk, set up his protective charm, and began to speak with the bird as he usually did. "There's something I need you to do," Scott said. "Find the home of Barty Crouch, head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation." Lambo cocked its head. "A wizard's house like that isn't easy to find. They don't sit still, use the flu, portkeys, apparition parties. They're everywhere." "I know," Scott said, "but there are always chances. He'll attend some big functions, travel with carriages sometimes." He smiled. "Like when we tracked a carriage to find Yaxley's place?" Lambo remembered and asked, "Will the Crouches throw banquets?" "No, well, probably not, but we can track his carriage." "That sort of chance doesn't come up often," Lambo muttered, clearly unhappy. "Just have a few crows keep an eye on Director Crouch," Scott said, smiling. "And then, after we find Crouch's house, what do you want to do?" Lambo asked. Scott lowered his voice and told the crow about Barty Crouch Jr. and the situation with Imperio, what he wanted to try to fix. Lambo shook its head fast. "You want to awaken someone controlled by Imperio? Are you going to go yourself? Can you do that?" "No," Scott said. "I won't go." Lambo fluttered up and pecked his hand. "So you want me to go? I can't do it either." "I have a simple method I can try," Scott said, smiling again. "First find Crouch's home." "All right, I'm off," Lambo said. "I'll need to visit the ministry to find where Crouch is, then let the other crows remember who Barty Crouch is before I come back." It beat its wings and leapt into the air. "Consider it done, friend," it said. Scott waved and watched the bird vanish into the tree line. He dispelled the charm, brushed grass clippings off his robes, and stood up. Two familiar magical signatures slid into his awareness. Luna and Savannah emerged from the forbidden forest together. "Good afternoon, Scott," Luna called, skipping forward with her usual airy cheerfulness. "We went to see that poor little Thestral." "Is it all right?" Scott asked. Luna shook her head. "It refuses to go back to Hagrid's hut. Hagrid built it a shed in the forest, but it's lonely." Savannah approached more slowly, keeping her head down. "Good afternoon, Scott," she said softly. Scott noticed the cowlick on the top of her head as she looked up. "Did you go see the Thestral too?" Of course," Savannah stammered, then colored as if she'd spoken too loudly. She lowered her voice to a whisper. "I like it very much." Luna giggled. "Savannah knows the forest well, better than me. That's interesting. She's very kind to animals. I like her." Luna took Savannah's hand before she even had a chance to react. "Thank you, Luna. I like you too," Savannah murmured, cheeks flushed, much more relaxed facing Luna than she had been with Scott. The two girls smiled at each other and almost immediately became friends. Scott watched them and thought, not without a wry amusement, what is this, a kindergarten friendship model? He almost opened his mouth to protest when Luna looked at him with bright, hopeful uncertainty. "So, does this mean we're friends now?" Savannah blinked, a little confused and a little pleased. Scott felt the urge to tell them he was not, in fact, their friendship enlightenment teacher. 305. New product, anti-hidden poison mask. "Hey, Scott!" It was Monday noon. Fred and George intercepted Scott as he was leaving the Great Hall after lunch. "What is it?" he asked. "Come with us." They led him down the third-floor corridor and stopped before a statue of a hunchbacked, one-eyed witch. "Isn't this the secret passage to Honeydukes?" Scott said. "Are you planning to sneak out at this hour?" Fred glanced left and right. "Of course not. You'll see when you go down." George tapped the statue with his wand and muttered, "Finite incantam." The witch's arched back swung open to reveal a dark passage and a long stone slide. "I'll go first." George crouched and shot down the slide like a flash. Fred clapped Scott on the shoulder. "You go first. Hurry." Scott hesitated, then slid down the stone chute. The wind whistled in his ears. Fred followed, his wand casting faint light. 10 minutes later, they reached the bottom. The room ahead was lit by magic. George stood waiting. Scott looked back at the door they'd come through. "We found this when we were buying things for customers a while ago," George said, pushing the door open. Fred accidentally hit the wall with a cutting charm, and that revealed it. Inside was a modest, somewhat shabby chamber. 3 noisy vents rattled in the ceiling. A cluster of old desks stood in the center, with candles guttering on them. Eddie, Scott's roommate, was already there, waving. "Eddie, No wonder I didn't see you at lunch, Scott said as he entered. Fred and George followed. This is going to be our joke product research workshop from now on, Fred announced. George added, we'll experiment on our inventions here so they won't be discovered. This is a pretty well-hidden spot, Scott admitted, perching on a broken stool. But did you really need to hide out specifically? There was no need before. Fred said, but there is now. Percy's been keeping a closer eye on us lately, George explained, because we seriously offended him, Fred added with a grin. As long as it's not a bother to you, Scott said, smiling. Even Filch doesn't know about this passageway. Of course not. Fred looked smug. Did you call me down here just to see the room? Scott glanced around. It was nothing special. Then George brightened. Besides the room, we've got a new product. Anti-hidden poison mask, Fred announced, producing an ordinary white mask from his pocket. Eddie sprang up. You actually did it? That's right, Fred said, slipping the mask on. George leaned over a desk and produced a small glass vial. This is viper venom. He uncorked the vial and held it near Fred's face. Bandages suddenly sprouted from the sides of the mask and tightened over Fred's mouth and nose. Brilliant, Eddie crowed. Even if the hidden poison wizard craze has died down a bit, this will sell. People's fear hasn't completely gone away, George said. There's still room to make a fortune. He moved the vial away, and the bandages retracted back into the mask. Eddie clapped. If this had been a month earlier, it might have swept the whole British magical market. It's not too late, though. Fred took off the mask and grinned at Scott. So, our partner who never cares about business? Scott didn't know what to say. Over the summer, the whole magical world had been talking about Medea and the Green Robbers occupying Edinburgh Castle. Scott had assumed the fuss he caused in the summer would have faded. Instead, rumors had grown. During the break, Borgin, owner of Borgin and Burke's in Nocturne Alley, and two young Yaxleys, Jack and Liam, had been poisoned. Of the three, only Liam Yaxley survived. The incident sparked wild speculation and fear. People whispered about a mysterious hidden poison wizard who could kill silently and without a trace. The story, which had started in the Quibbler and spread for reasons Scott didn't understand, had taken on a life of its own. Scott knew, accurately, that none of it had anything to do with him. He rubbed his chin. It's a clever invention. I don't think it'll be used in Hogwarts, but students might buy them and send them home. Eddie was delighted. Let's speed up production. I have a feeling demand will be high. I can help. Oh, you can't help us much, Eddie, Fred said, but George patted Eddie on the shoulder. You're in charge of raw materials. Get more masks and bandages. Lunch break ended quickly. They mounted a few battered flying brooms they kept hidden by the slide and shot back up the passage. Once they reached the third-floor corridor, they dropped the brooms into the chute to slide back down. All the while, Fred, George, and Eddie excitedly argued over their plan to make money with the anti-hidden poison mask. Scott listened, half amused and half conflicted. The Weasley twins' new product, the anti-hidden poison mask, drew attention the moment it hit the market. Just as Eddie had predicted, the news about the hidden poison wizard had faded from the headlines, overshadowed by Medea's attack on Edinburgh Castle, but the fear of unseen poisoners hadn't disappeared. The masks the twins had already produced sold out within hours, and many Hogwarts students put in pre-orders. They said they felt safe at school, but their families did not. With the Christmas holidays approaching, everyone wanted protection for the time they would be away from Hogwarts. Orders piled up so fast the twins were swamped, and Scott found himself strangely unsettled by their success. Slytherin leaves, Edinburgh returns to peace, blared the front page of the Daily Prophet on Thursday morning, and the headlines set the school talking. The ministry's operation to retake the castle hadn't even formally begun when, after 10 days of occupation, Medea and her Green Robbers simply withdrew. The report said the protective wards around Edinburgh Castle vanished on Wednesday night, and the Aurors stationed there moved in, only to find the place empty. According to the official story, Medea fled in fear of ministry reprisals. Scott didn't buy it. He suspected Medea had left because she finally used whatever hidden magical source lay buried in the castle, and had drained it dry. If Medea already had Nagini, Voldemort's Horcrux, A sacrificial ritual powered by the castle's magic would make sense. Scott even wondered whether her attack on the Merlin Order's stronghold had been aimed at sacrificing the soul fragment sealed in the Resurrection Stone ring. He ran through Voldemort's 7 Horcruxes in his head. The diary, the Resurrection Stone ring, Ravenclaw's diadem, Hufflepuff's cup, Slytherin's locket, Nagini, and Harry. Dumbledore had accidentally awakened Medea when he destroyed the diary. At the time, Medea had an oath with Hogwarts Castle that apparently counted the diary's fragment as an acceptable sacrifice. Now, with the Resurrection Stone ring and Nagini in her possession, Medea might have already sacrificed 3 fragments. Ravenclaw's diadem had been purified by Ravenclaw herself. Because she used gentle purification rather than violent destruction, the soul fragment in the diadem had returned to Voldemort's main soul through the connections between souls. Scott remembered mentioning the diadem's purification in passing once. He had seen Medea's reaction when she heard about it and knew she understood the implication. Of the remaining Horcruxes, excluding Harry, who was exceptional, the cup and the locket were the 2 others to worry about. The cup was the easiest target. Voldemort had entrusted it to Bellatrix Lestrange and hidden it in the Lestrange vault at Gringotts. The locket's story was more convoluted. The real locket had been swapped, and if one looked where Voldemort had hidden it originally, only a fake would be found. Medea had been searching Death Eaters' homes. It was only a matter of time before she turned toward Gringotts, if she hadn't already. A Ravenclaw mentor in a portrait had told Scott that Medea needed the complete sacrifice of Voldemort's soul to recover fully. It was an ancestor-descendant struggle. Whichever of them eliminated the other would have a free hand. Medea had to consume Voldemort's soul fragments to be whole again. Voldemort would not be free to rebuild without dealing with Medea first. That was why Scott had been tempted to help Voldemort in secret. If the Dark Lord could regain some of his power, Scott reasoned, Medea's hunt for Horcruxes would matter less. Horcruxes were fragments. The main soul was what counted. Dumbledore might be a common enemy to both of them, but Scott doubted any cooperation between the 2 antagonists was likely. Early December at last, and Lambeau arrived with the news Scott had been waiting for. Barty Crouch's house had been located. "How do you want to proceed?" Lambeau asked. Scott reached into his deformed lizard skin bag and pulled out a tiny wooden figure he'd prepared long ago. It was no larger than a pinky. "Put this in Crouch's house," he said. Lambeau snorted. "What is this supposed to do? You told me Barty Crouch Jr. is under his father's Imperius. Can it lift the Imperius?" "The Imperius can only be broken by the victim's own will," Scott said. "The victim has to focus everything on resisting the voice forcing their actions." He kept the little figure in his palm. "Don't let it touch any other wizard until it's placed. Find a time when old Barty isn't home and slip it inside. It will seek out the wizard who lives there, Barty, and whisper a message into his ear on loop. After a while, it self-destructs." "What will it say?" Lambeau asked, curious despite himself. "Remind Barty that his master is in danger and needs his help," Scott said. "I don't know if it will work. It's a gamble. This depends on whether Barty's insane loyalty to his master can break through whatever hold the Imperius still has." "There's a house elf," Lambeau hesitated. "That complicates getting it inside." Scott smiled. "The Raven can distract the house elf for a little while." That night, Scott got Lambeau's report on the operation. He had just finished a Charm Club activity and was climbing the spiral staircase of Ravenclaw Tower when the Raven sailed in through a high window and landed on his shoulder. Scott went back to his dormitory to drop his books off, then slipped into the bathroom. After casting a silencing charm in a cubicle, he sat on the toilet and spoke quietly with Lambeau. "The operation went smoothly," Lambeau said. "I tossed that little wooden figure through the window and into the room while the house elf was screaming and shooing the other crows away." "Thank you, Lambeau." Scott's voice was soft. Lambeau still sounded unsure. "Are you sure your plan will work? We have no way to know whether that thing can free Barty Crouch Jr. from the Imperius curse. The crows are still watching from a distance, and I haven't heard anything about him escaping." "It was only a try," Scott added quickly. "If it doesn't work, we'll try something else." "All right," Lambeau said. "I'll tell you if I hear anything about Barty Crouch Jr. getting away." Scott smiled. You might still need to keep an eye on him personally, friend. Why? Lambo cocked his head. He could apparate, use the flu network, or wear an invisibility cloak. The crows wouldn't see those. Scott lowered his head to meet the raven's dark eyes and murmured, Only you can tell by the other signs. The house elf's behavior, the food, the way Barty Crouch acts when he's at home. All right, you're always right, Lambo said resignedly. I'll go now. It shot up and out through the vent in the ceiling. We'll definitely win this week's match. As Scott pushed the dormitory door open again, Roger's confident voice carried from the common room. This time, our opponent is Hufflepuff? Scott walked in. Hufflepuff? He asked. That's who you're so confident about? Roger turned with a displeased look. Say it like that, and it sounds like you're sneering at our team. Scott went straight to the window seat and sat. Given how the team's been doing, he said without mercy, only Hufflepuff could give you this much assurance. Roger immediately grinned. Oh, Scott, you'll regret saying that. Eddie, beside him, put on a smug expression as well. Scott raised an eyebrow. Has your training been paying off? You'll see, Roger said, keeping him in suspense. Eddie stuck his chin out proudly. Scott smirked and asked, Eddie collected key intelligence and the tactical advisory group put together a winning plan? Roger blinked, surprised, and looked to Eddie. Eddie blinked back and changed the subject. By the way, Scott, you've got a customer coming for arithmancy this week. Arithmancy? I remember your threshold was high. Who spent 30 galleons on your useless trinkets to pay for a reading? 30 galleons was a lot for Hogwarts students. Eddie and the Weasley twins didn't sell expensive things. I think she spent it on your arithmancy, Eddie shrugged. I never saw her using our stuff. So who is it? Savannah Doherty, Eddie said, smiling. Ravenclaw, 2nd year. This will be her 2nd arithmancy session. Savannah? Scott felt genuine surprise. All right, schedule her for Friday afternoon. That's tomorrow. Afternoon classes finish early. The next afternoon, Scott waited for Savannah in an empty classroom. Eddie and the Weasley twins stood watch at the door as usual. Savannah came alone, keeping her head down. Her voice was small when she spoke. Savannah, is this about something you need calculated? Or has your brother's situation changed? Scott asked. No. The red-haired girl lifted her face. This time it's for me. She was only 12 and still had a childlike roundness to her face. Her clear green eyes showed a trace of worry. What do you want to calculate? Scott asked. Savannah's eyelids drooped. Her long lashes trembled. The Christmas holiday. Her voice dropped to a whisper. We don't really celebrate Christmas, but I want to know if I'll be able to come back to Hogwarts after the holiday. Scott's brow lifted. What do you mean? Are your parents making you leave school? No, she shook her head. I have to do something over the break. A trial. I don't know if I'll succeed. A dangerous trial? Is it compulsory? Scott asked, surprised. He tried to think of archaic rites or druidic tests, but it was 1993. This sounded darker. Savannah's face had gone a little pale. Scott hesitated, then said, I don't want to pry, Savannah, but he sighed. You should know the limits of arithmancy. It isn't the same as divination. For a question like this, I probably can't give a precise answer. Because there aren't enough known conditions? She asked. Exactly. Scott nodded. Savannah opened her mouth as if to add more, but faltered. Scott gave her time. It was her privacy and her choice whether to speak. After a moment, she whispered, Just calculate it like this. It's okay if it isn't accurate. She still wouldn't reveal everything. Scott had no right to force it. Still, he added, out of responsibility, Are you sure? If you want something more definitive, you might see Professor Trelawney. Savannah shook her head. No, I trust your arithmancy. Scott felt a little helpless. He didn't entirely trust his own method either, but it was the customer's request, so he nodded and prepared to begin. Scott performed an arithmancy reading for Savannah, but with so few known variables, the result was inevitably vague. The divination looks favorable. You will return to Hogwarts, he told her. It was more encouragement than prediction. There hadn't been enough data to say anything definite. Thank you, Savannah said at once, smiling as if she had heard exactly what she wanted. She stood, put 2 galleons on Scott's desk, and without waiting for a reply, turned and darted out of the classroom. That evening after dinner, Scott went to the room of requirement. Since the next day was Saturday, and Ravenclaw had a Quidditch match in the morning, he decided to make up some study time on Friday night. He tapped the portrait of Rowena Ravenclaw to wake her. Mentor. Curiosity pushed him to tell her about Savannah. The portrait listened, then said, "The Druids were founded by the Celts here in Britain. Tradition says they would set a candidate adrift at sea for many days. If anyone survived, they were buried. If they survived both ordeals, they could be formally accepted into the Druids." "Is that what Savannah meant by the test?" Scott asked. "If you're allowed to use magic during it, it doesn't sound too hard." Ravenclaw shook her head. "That is the initiation test. Presumably a child would have already passed it before coming to school. You once said her magic is unusual. She can already become a wolf, didn't you say?" "I assumed that shape-changing was an inherited family thing," Scott admitted. "I didn't expect the Druids to keep such traditions into the late 20th century. Ravenclaw's expression grew thoughtful. "To become a full Druid priest, one must undergo what is called the triple death." Scott's eyes widened. He remembered his arithmancy reading for Savannah's brother, Aaron. The result had been the number 3. That reading had suggested Aaron's body lay in a deep sleep, his consciousness half awake, while his spirit was very active. Could that be the aftermath of a triple death? Savannah had said her brother had disappeared earlier. She might have been lying, but the coincidence made Scott uneasy. "Do you know what the triple death involves?" he asked. "I don't," Ravenclaw admitted. 1,000 years ago, the Druids were few. They are an exclusive order. I thought they had died out. Rowena Ravenclaw knew very little of modern Druids. Scott had once asked about their transfiguration and why they could adopt more than one animal form. She only knew it was tied to their unique magic and the purity of it, not how they achieved such purity. Their conversation stalled there. Scott's curiosity wasn't satisfied, but there was nothing more he could press her for. He felt sorry for the little girl who had clearly taken a liking to him. He hoped Savannah would not suffer the same separation of body, mind, and spirit that seemed to have befallen her brother, but for now, that was all he could do. When he prepared to leave, Ravenclaw, perhaps worried for him, offered what help she could. As his mentor, she could not directly intervene, she reminded him, but she could give advice. "Perhaps you should speak to Professor Dumbledore," she said. "He is headmaster, and you are a student. He should protect you. He has the power to protect you. And you should devote more attention to your studies." Scott looked into the painted eyes and didn't entirely believe she was being purely helpful. "Mentor," he asked, "you've said that even if you could protect me, you wouldn't. Why are you suggesting I go under someone else's protection?" Ravenclaw smiled faintly. "If you can secure Dumbledore's patronage and grow under his protection, that is a skill I admire." Scott couldn't help but think her way of describing clinging to a powerful figure was elegantly phrased. Still, he shook his head. "You know what I've done," he said, "and Dumbledore is a Gryffindor." He meant that he wasn't sure their values would align. Dumbledore's moral line was high. At the very least, Scott doubted the headmaster would ever condone anything resembling an alliance with Voldemort to solve other problems. People with deeply opposed views were rarely comfortable allies. "Gryffindor? What are you worried about?" Ravenclaw asked, unconcerned. Scott thought about the old rivalries. If Godric Gryffindor were her peer, if the ancient friendships and enmities between founders still carried weight, it could complicate things. "You can imagine if Godric Gryffindor were your elder," he began. Ravenclaw's painted expression shifted for a moment, then she smiled again. "Never mind. Perhaps Dumbledore will not approve of your actions," she said kindly. "Be cautious. Don't play with fire." She dismissed him with a wave. By the time Scott left the room of requirement, it was very late. He took a longer route back to avoid Peeves' antics and Filch with Madame Norris on patrol. When he returned to the dormitory, his 3 roommates were already asleep. He slipped in quietly, washed, and collapsed into bed. Early Saturday morning, he was awakened by shouting, "Ravenclaw! Go! Ravenclaw, go!" He opened his eyes to find Eddie, face painted and waving a small flag, shouting and jumping on his bed. Scott reached under his pillow for his wand and cast Petrificus Totalis, pinning him rigid and silencing the cheering. 309. Victory. Early morning conversation. Early Saturday morning, Roger, the Quidditch captain, had already left. In the dormitory, Milton was carefully maintaining his wand. When Scott woke up, Milton looked up and greeted him. "Good morning, Scott." "Good morning, Milton," Scott answered. He climbed out of bed, ignored Eddie, frozen in a comical pose in the middle of the room, and headed to the washroom. By the time he finished and came back, Milton was still at work on his wand, and Eddie stood stiffly like a statue. Scott ignored Eddie's pitiful gaze again, walked past him without a glance, changed out of his pajamas, and began dressing. Shirt, socks, trousers, leather shoes, sweater, robes, scarf. When he was fully dressed, he fixed his hair in the mirror. "About time," he said, then turned to Milton. "Let's go have breakfast." He slipped his pocket watch away, hung the misshapen lizard skin satchel on his belt, pulled on his warm leather gloves, and wrapped his fingers around his wand. "Okay," Milton said, satisfied with the wand in his hand. He stood, put on his scarf and gloves, and followed Scott toward the dormitory door. Only when Milton opened the door did Scott turn back and wave his wand, releasing the Petrificus Totalis on Eddie. Eddie stumbled and almost fell. "You jerk! My legs are all numb," he roared, lurching toward them. Scott smiled and gave Eddie's wrist a light shake. Eddie immediately stopped and brightened. "Let's go. Breakfast. I'm starving," he said, as if nothing had happened. Half an hour before the Quidditch match was scheduled to begin, almost all the teachers and students were already seated in the towering stands around the stadium. Scott used a duplicating charm to make a copy of Eddie's Ravenclaw pennant and held it in his hand. Soon, the Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff players emerged from the dressing rooms on their brooms, fell into precise formations, and began to circle the pitch. Cheers erupted from both houses' stands. Scott yawned, only becoming alert once the match started. As it went on, he understood the source of Roger's earlier confidence. Ravenclaw was changing formations quickly and effectively. Whenever Hufflepuff made a move, Ravenclaw countered almost instantly with the ideal response. "Seems you didn't just peek at Hufflepuff's training," Scott said to Eddie, having even identified several formations Hufflepuff had prepared. "Of course," Eddie said, proud as if his nose might tilt higher. As the match continued, Hufflepuff grew frustrated by being constantly countered and eventually abandoned their formations, choosing to play freely. Eddie pumped his fist in the stands, just as Scott expected. Ravenclaw had predicted that reaction and were ready. When Hufflepuff broke formation, Ravenclaw would switch into their drilled standard formations. The match finished smoothly before noon, with Ravenclaw victorious. Ravenclaw's Seeker, Cho, with help from two teammates, outmaneuvered Cedric and caught the golden snitch. Amid the cheers, Scott sat smiling but unsurprised. When the strengths of two sides aren't wildly different, careful planning and smarter tactics make victory far more likely. Scott didn't join in the celebrations. After lunch, he went to the room of requirement to spend the rest of the day. Barty really escaped. Early Sunday morning, Lambo brought him the news. "I wasn't sure until last night," the bird told him, "but I saw old Crouch angrily punishing his house elf." Scott stood on the elevated stone bridge where the morning mist drifted over the chasm below. He held out his arm and let Lambo alight there. "So neither you nor the crows actually saw Barty take off with your own eyes?" he asked. Lambo nodded. "But it's true. I saw that poor house elf searching for its master by Crouch's house all night." "That's good," Scott said, smiling. "I don't expect Barty to definitely find Crouch." Lambo looked puzzled. "You said you released Barty to help Lord Voldemort regain some strength to make Voldemort and Medea fight and ease the pressure on you, right?" "You're right," Scott said. "I only provided a possibility. Beyond that, it's not my concern." "But," Lambo protested, "if Barty can't find Voldemort, wouldn't that waste our efforts and ruin your plan?" "That's okay too," Scott smiled. Lambo flapped up to perch on his shoulder. "Why do you say that? Didn't you say you deliberately increased the difficulty for Medea because you worried she was getting too idle and might start bothering you?" "I can only do so much," Scott shrugged. "If that Dark Lord can't rise again and simply becomes Medea's meal, what can I do?" Lambo looked worried. "Aren't you concerned about Medea's little attempts to tame me?" Scott turned to it. Lambo nodded. "Worrying won't help," Scott said. "I just don't want distractions. That's why I nudged Voldemort forward. It doesn't mean I can't handle Medea's tricks." If the plan worked, Great. If not, it was still manageable. He started toward the Great Hall. I have over 2 years left at Hogwarts. I have a feeling that's probably the deadline Medea's set. She won't take more drastic measures before I graduate. Did she tell you that? Lambeau asked. No, Scott replied. It's an unspoken understanding. He smiled confidently. I have the best mentor and the best learning conditions now. I believe I'll be strong enough to protect myself before I graduate. Just as Scott and Lambeau had predicted, he couldn't be sure whether Barty, who'd run away after Scott's careful nudging, would actually find Lord Voldemort. But feedback arrived sooner than he expected. It didn't come from Harry, as Scott had half hoped. It came from someone he'd overlooked, Professor Severus Snape. The dark mark Voldemort brands on his followers, Scott suspected, reflected the Dark Lord's condition more directly than any Horcrux like Harry. More than 10 days after confirming Barty's escape, Scott felt an odd ripple through his senses during potions. It happened while Snape was patrolling the classroom. In Scott's magical perception, a trace of power that did not belong to the potions lesson suddenly flared on Snape's left arm. The magic felt cold and malevolent. On the surface, Snape appeared his usual composed self as he moved down the aisle, checking students' work, but Scott noticed a hesitation in his footsteps. Curious, he widened and sharpened his senses to study that trace. Whatever he opened up was too much. For a sickening instant, grotesque images flooded his mind, mountains of corpses, a sea of blood, and the smell of iron hit him so real he almost retched. He had to forcibly pull his perception back. In that moment, he involuntarily made a face. Snape happened to turn and catch it. Everything happened fast. Scott met the potions master's dark, hollow gaze for a heartbeat, realized the danger, and bent his head to resume grinding ingredients. Snape crossed the room in a single glide to the desk, bending to watch Scott's hands. Scott kept his expression calm and kept working. He noticed his partner, Milton Greaves, breathing fast, fingers trembling. Scott moved to take the small knife and herbs from Milton and handed him the mortar and pestle instead. Snape sniffed. How touching, Mr. Greaves. Is Mr. Trollope your nurse in potions? Milton's hand fumbled as he weighed the ingredients. A tremor sent them spilling onto the table. Snape straightened at the mess. Unbelievable for a 5th year, Greaves, he said, sour. Ravenclaw, -2 points for clumsiness. He turned away and left. Milton looked as if he might cry. Scott swallowed a sigh. Snape's tricks never failed. They had to start the batch over and fell behind. Only long after class ended did they finish and submit their potions. Snape handled the 2 bottles with an impatient glance and, to Milton, said, I look forward to the day you can work unaided, Greaves. Milton kept his head down. You can go first, Snape added. I need to speak with Mr. Trollope alone. Milton shot Scott a worried look. Scott smiled and waved him off. After Milton left, Snape set the potion down and turned to Scott, that hollow stare fixed on him. Scott had already slid into a clumency, hiding whatever flitted across his mind, and didn't look away. A clumency, Snape purred. I don't recall Hogwarts teaching that to you, Mr. Trollope. His tone was mocking. The genius. Scott didn't back down. I also don't recall a professor being able to use legilimency on a student professor. Don't smile. Snape's voice dropped into that sibilant hiss. The lines between his brows were hard and deep. You're using your so-called magical perception to pry into your professor. That's extremely rude, Mr. Trollope. Scott kept his answer simple. Sorry, Professor. He didn't argue. Professors like Snape were not appeased by cleverness. The truth was he hadn't meant to be intrusive. He habitually scanned the room now and then, a habit normally invisible to others. Today, he had simply failed to mask his reaction. Fortunately, the evil flare had hit his senses so hard that his thoughts had been occupied only by the nausea and horror, not by anything specific like the dark mark itself. Snape's displeasure deepened. Tell me, what did you perceive? A trace of evil magic became active on your left hand, Professor, Scott said plainly. Snape's face blackened. He clasped his left arm with his right hand and muttered, Damn it. He paced a few short steps, clearly disturbed. Then, furious, he resumed his cutting sarcasm. No sense of propriety, always eager to show off. Why didn't that tattered sorting hat pluck you for Gryffindor? Scott bowed his head and pouted inwardly. He felt unfairly accused, but he knew better than to answer. If I could, I'd give you a memory charm to clear that overly curious head of yours." Snape snapped, then turned and strode from the classroom. "Follow me, Mr. Trollope." Scott followed obediently. As they moved through the castle, students watched, and many sent him thumbs up or knowing looks. Some thought he'd brazenly provoked Snape. Snape's expression was so grim that the onlookers assumed Scott had earned it. 311. Dumbledore's questioning Snape brought Scott to the headmaster's office as quickly as he dared. They entered by the third-floor entrance and rode the self-rising stone staircase up to the 8th floor. "Wait here obediently," Snape barked. He glanced back at Scott, pushed open the office door, walked in, and shut it behind him. Scott stood by the railing of the stone staircase and looked out over the castle through the glass. He guessed Snape was inside, reporting the Dark Mark's strange activity to Dumbledore. As for why Snape had brought him along, Scott supposed the professor had few options. Snape could neither plausibly obviate him nor easily explain the Mark's anomaly, so he dumped the problem on Dumbledore. That, in fact, was what happened. The office door reopened quickly, and Snape strode out. "Go in, Mr. Trollope." The annoyance had been smoothed away from his face. Snape even offered a very artificial smile. He then mounted the descending stairs and left without looking back. Scott sighed, took a breath, and stepped into the headmaster's office. Dumbledore sat behind his great desk and greeted him with a kindly smile. "Good afternoon, Professor Dumbledore," Scott said. "Good afternoon, Scott," Dumbledore replied, waving him over. "Do come sit. Perhaps we should have a good talk." Scott sat on the stool in front of the desk. "Would you like something to drink?" Dumbledore snapped his fingers and a porcelain cup appeared before Scott. "Tea will be fine. No sugar, thank you." "Oh, no sugar. Such a pity," Dumbledore said, a mock note of regret in his voice. He snapped his fingers again, and steaming black tea appeared. Scott accepted the cup and took a sip. "I don't really like sweets." "I was about to offer some delicious cockroach clusters," Dumbledore said, savoring the phrase. Scott smiled. "You should keep them for yourself." "Very well." Dumbledore nodded and took a sip from his own cup. He seemed unusually cheerful. After a moment, he asked, almost casually, "It seems you weren't terribly curious about what happened to Severus." Scott shook his head. "No, Professor. I don't usually pry into other people's affairs." "That's normal," Dumbledore chuckled. "Many Ravenclaws are like you." Scott didn't object. "We're not as demonstrative as Gryffindor or Hufflepuff. We prefer to keep our distance in interpersonal matters." "Do you think that's good or bad?" Dumbledore asked, genuinely curious. Scott considered it briefly. "For me, there's no good or bad. Everyone has their own way of living. Choosing the most comfortable way is fine." "You're right, everyone is different," Dumbledore smiled. "As long as it doesn't harm others." Scott nodded. Dumbledore seemed pleased. He sipped his tea, far too sweet, Scott thought, and said softly, "It seems Severus's worries were unnecessary. I need not say more to you, do I?" "I will keep it a secret," Scott answered. He hesitated, then added, "Although the magic that appeared on Professor Snape's arm felt very evil to me. Since you trust him, of course that must mean he is all right." "Thank you for your trust, Scott." Dumbledore's tone was warm. Scott returned the smile. "Most people at Hogwarts trust you. You are Dumbledore." "You used the word most," Dumbledore said with a mock sigh. "I suppose I haven't done enough as headmaster." Scott shrugged, mildly amused. "Education is a responsibility shared by school and family." "Ah, hearing you say that makes me feel much better." Dumbledore brightened. Scott was about to take his leave when Dumbledore asked, "Do you know what the anomaly on Severus's arm signifies?" Scott's hand froze over his teacup. He hadn't expected the question, but feigning ignorance in front of the headmaster felt wrong. He answered plainly, "It probably means that the Dark Lord, Lord Voldemort, has recovered some strength." "We have never believed he truly vanished," Dumbledore murmured. "Horcruxes ensure a part of him endures. He could return when least expected." Scott set his cup down and listened to Dumbledore's quiet reflection. The headmaster did not press him on how he'd linked Snape's mark to Voldemort. Instead, he leaned forward with an encouraging look. "As an old man, I like to hear the thoughts of the young, particularly intelligent young people, such as yourself. What do you make of this?" Scott answered without hesitation. Although Voldemort may be regaining power, his greatest problem might be Medea's desire for his soul. Dumbledore's eyebrows rose. Medea? Scott was certain Dumbledore, as headmaster, would know of Medea's interest in the Dark Lord's soul. It traced back to an oath made with Hogwarts itself. Before the true Rowena Ravenclaw vanished, she had spoken with Dumbledore, and an oath had been sworn on behalf of Hogwarts. Rowena had explained it to later generations. Scott realized this was a good moment to put Dumbledore on notice about Voldemort's recovery, and perhaps to warn Medea indirectly. He glanced briefly at the tapestry on the wall as he continued. Yes, Rowena Ravenclaw told me about the oath Medea made with the castle. On one wall of the headmaster's office, rows of portraits of former Hogwarts headmasters hung in neat lines. In Scott's peripheral vision, they all seemed to be dozing, uninterested in his conversation with Dumbledore. But Scott was certain they were listening. Medea had once revealed she knew he'd used arithmancy to calculate Voldemort's Horcrux, which implied she had a way of hearing at least some of the conversations that took place in the headmaster's office. Back then, Scott had suspected the most unpopular headmaster in Hogwarts history, Phineas Black, but it was only a guess. Whatever the method, the portraits were the likeliest source. If one of them was passing news along to Medea, that could work in Scott's favor. Medea would not want Voldemort to recover fully. If Voldemort regained his strength, she might not be able to seize his soul, and without that sacrifice, she could not completely restore herself. A fully restored Voldemort would be stronger than she, and Scott needed Medea distracted. Busy with Voldemort, she wouldn't be paying attention to him, a still underage wizard. Scott, Dumbledore said again, the activity of that lady may not be good for the magical world. What do you think? Scott nodded. Medea, despite being more pragmatic than those of her line, was still recklessly undermining the world's stability. Those Thestrals, he interrupted, remembering they had been stolen. Why not take them back? Dumbledore sighed. I worry how we'll make the carriages run next term, he said. It's a pity I'm getting too old. Scott bit back a comment. Dumbledore might be old, very old, but he was hardly helpless with his wand. The headmaster had brushed his question aside and moved on, smiling as he spoke. So you think, even if Voldemort regains power, he'll be forced to deal with Medea first? That's what I think, Scott said. Medea needs Voldemort's soul to regain strength, and Voldemort will want to eliminate any threat to his rise. Those will be their priorities. I never expected Lord Voldemort, to face such a threat, Dumbledore mused. I don't imagine he'll tolerate it. Scott had his doubts, but Dumbledore's expression shifted. Perhaps letting the two of them wear each other down, ideally both taking heavy losses while we step in afterwards to clean up the mess. That would be clever. Scott silently repeated the word clever in his head. Dumbledore sighed and then, with an expression of genuine concern, added, But we can't do that. Do you know why? Scott went silent. Because we're not the Ministry? He thought, but he kept the response to himself. You know, Scott, Dumbledore said patiently. Scott did know where this was going. If Voldemort and Medea were left to fight, Britain's entire magical community would be plunged into chaos. There would be social collapse and countless innocents caught in the crossfire. But Scott couldn't see why Dumbledore was confiding this in him. He wasn't a savior, and he didn't pretend to care for the world in the headmaster's way. Dumbledore waited as Scott kept silent. Can't figure out why I'm telling you this, he asked with a small smile. Scott only nodded. He was puzzled. Dumbledore's smile grew broader, and the atmosphere relaxed. I've been at this school for many years, he said, feigning a little absent-mindedness. Oh, more years than I can count, I suppose. Scott watched him, curious. I've seen countless students pass through this castle. Dumbledore looked out the window. Most went on to ordinary lives as ordinary witches and wizards, which is good, of course. He was lost in memory for a moment. Some became ministers for magic. Some became experts in their fields. Some became heroes. Few, one or two, slid down darker paths, and some became a Dark Lord. He turned back to Scott. I think you're a special student, Scott. Your talent is plain to see. Thank you, Professor, Scott said. But I won't be a hero, and I won't be the Dark Lord. Dumbledore nodded. Perhaps a scholar, then, or a professor. Scott gave a small, non-committal smile. He had no career plan. What you become isn't the important part, Dumbledore continued, and I am certain you will not become the Dark Lord. What I told you about Voldemort and Miss Slytherin is not something for you to deal with. You're still a student. He paused to sip his tea. I've noticed you helped Neville Longbottom and Jacob Kent make changes. That was very good. He regarded Scott with genuine appreciation. Sometimes the bright ideas of young people like you inspire old men like me. It wasn't much, Scott shrugged. Just a few clever tricks. Dumbledore's expression turned a little more solemn. What saddens me is that you are often unwilling to change yourself, he said earnestly. The smartest choice is not always the best choice. I hope you understand that. Scott opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He knew Dumbledore had seen through him to some extent. He had no wish to fake contrition or promise to be virtuous. That would be useless, and Dumbledore wouldn't believe it. Dumbledore smiled, a twinkle returning to his eyes, and winked. I always thought stubbornness was a fault only an old man like me could have. 313. A profound self-analysis. In the headmaster's office, Scott's face was tense. He didn't know what to say. He understood that Dumbledore meant well, but he wasn't willing to lie. He had no intention of changing himself simply because of this conversation. He opened his mouth a few times and finally said nothing. Dumbledore, however, remained warm. Don't feel pressured, he said with a smile. Take it as an elder's advice, or an old man's nagging if you prefer. Scott pursed his lips and gave a small nod. I'll think about it, he murmured. You still have plenty of time to grow, Dumbledore added. After leaving the headmaster's office, Scott walked through the castle in a complicated mood. He wondered whether he should withdraw from everything and focus only on his studies. He felt his chest tighten. When he received his Hogwarts letter at 11, he had a plan. Enroll, keep a low profile, avoid trouble, and study. For the first 3 years, it had worked. He stayed out of the Philosopher's Stone mess entirely. But starting in his 4th year, as if fate itself intervened, trouble kept finding him. What began as a small trick to get proof of a basilisk's existence had escalated. He ended up fighting to the death on Christmas Eve, his hands stained with blood. The death of Jasmine Travers was a turning point. After that, calamities followed one another. Whatever psychological defenses he'd had broke down. He found he could calmly and decisively remove people who threatened him, and he even began using his foresight to steer events. The death of Travers, the scramble among 3 pure-blood families, and the ministry over the Travers inheritance, helping to provoke and direct those events, had inflated his confidence. So when Medea threatened his freedom, his instinct was to unleash Lord Voldemort, Medea's predator and enemy. As headmaster and master of this castle, Dumbledore might not know everything Scott had done, but he could sense parts of Scott's character he didn't approve of. After thinking it through, Scott realized that the chain of events had been triggered, somewhat absurdly, by that kid Jacob. He laughed inwardly at the thought. Of course, it was a joke. Ultimately, it was his own character that dictated his choices. Unconsciously, Scott had walked back onto the elevated stone bridge that led outside the castle. Evening had fallen, the sky was dim, and night was coming. He'd followed Snape to the headmaster's office after potions that afternoon and had skipped dinner. Standing on the bridge in the cold wind, he tightened his cloak and wrapped his scarf around his neck again. Though he still didn't want to change, Dumbledore's words had set him thinking. Before today, Scott had never considered his actions wrong. His guiding principle had been simple. Everyone looks out for themselves, and if others threatened him, he wouldn't be blamed for striking first. He'd always felt justified. But Dumbledore's words, and something else stirring inside him, made him suddenly remember his previous life. That memory clarified things. He had changed. In his former life, he'd been vengeful, yes, but only in thought. He'd never carried his grudges to true, lethal lengths. Those who offended him had never threatened his life. This world, chaotic and unlike the stable, peaceful society he'd known before, had altered him. Or rather, he had adapted to it. Even that explanation felt incomplete. The wind howled like some monstrous cry, but Scott no longer felt cold. His muddled thoughts cleared, and he began to analyze himself as if from a detached, objective vantage point. Maybe it was a flaw of carrying memories from another life. Before Hogwarts, The magical world had been nothing more than the backdrop of a story to him. He'd brought a preconceived impression that it was dangerous and prone to turmoil. That subconscious fear added pressure and insecurity, nudging him to retaliate more fiercely against perceived threats. There were other causes, too, the arrogance that comes with wielding power. If he'd remained a Muggle, he would have been more likely to call the police when faced with danger. As a wizard, he'd preferred to take matters into his own hands. Scott let out a short, private laugh. Dumbledore had called him stubborn and resistant to change, but in truth, he had changed a great deal, just not for the better. The realization didn't unsettle him. On the contrary, it relieved him. In the cold December wind, he'd performed a thorough self-examination and found faults, but he felt no compulsion to fix them obediently. He rubbed his numb face, smiled faintly, stamped his feet to warm them, and turned back toward the Great Hall. He accepted the truth that truth, goodness, and beauty are commendable. He knew that, but he didn't have to be their vessel. The magical world was not a fairy tale of pure ideals. The conversation with Dumbledore had mattered. It had helped him understand himself. Under the headmaster's gentle admonition, Scott came to know and accept himself exactly as he was. 3:14. Encounter in the kitchen. Scott, chilled from standing in the cold wind, hurried back into the castle. Dinner had already ended. Hungry, he made his way to the corridor on the basement level where the Hufflepuff common room was tucked away. Under the amused eyes of a few students, he reached out and tickled a pear in a still-life painting. The pear twisted as if being prodded and became a brass doorknob. Scott turned it and pushed the door open. The kitchen was brightly lit and bustling. Hogwarts house elves darted about, using magic to send dirty plates leaping into the sink, sending brooms and rags to scrub, and chopping ingredients for the next day. Scott's entrance drew every eye. For a moment, all work stopped. Dozens of round, wide eyes fixed on him. Then a chorus of sharp, overlapping voices rang out. "Ah, it's a little wizard." "Good evening, esteemed sir. Is there anything you require?" "Happy to serve you, sir." Scott's gaze swept the room until it settled on a familiar house elf, Lulu, the one Professor Flitwick had sent to protect Jacob's family. "Lulu," he called. At the sound of the name, the kitchen quieted. "Lulu is here, sir," someone answered, and Lulu hurried forward, pushing through the others. They looked up at Scott, wiped their hands on a tea towel, and asked respectfully, "May I help you, esteemed sir?" "Give me something to eat," Scott said, moving to the long table and sitting. "I missed dinner." "Of course, sir. What would you like? Shepherd's pie, steak, sweet baked apple crumble, hot cocoa?" Lulu recited. It had been so cold that Scott ordered calorie-rich food. Within moments, several house elves were helping, and Scott had his meal. He was just tucking in when the kitchen door opened again. Luna and Savannah came in together. Scott, with his mouth full, offered them a quick nod. Luna ran over to the house elves to say a few words, then took Savannah's hand and slid into the seat beside him. "Good evening, Scott," Luna said. "Didn't you have dinner?" Scott asked. He nodded that he hadn't. "Good evening," Savannah said softly. "We already ate," Luna replied with a smile. "We came to pick up some meat." "To feed the little Thestral?" Scott guessed. Luna nodded. "Hagrid fed it, but what I brought are just snacks. It gets lonely and needs company." Scott nodded and resumed eating. Abruptly, Luna turned toward him and fixed him with those slightly bulging eyes of hers. "I can't quite say," she began dreamily. "Perhaps an unknown magical creature visited your brain. Not a Sorrow Meng, though." "Visited? So they left already? How can you tell?" Scott asked. "There are traces," Luna said, studying him. She rummaged in her knitted satchel and pulled out a pair of oddly shaped glasses, slipping them on. "Oh," she sighed, then took the glasses off again, frustrated. "It seems there's still a lot I don't understand." She glanced at Savannah. "Do you know Savannah?" "Me?" Savannah looked up, surprised, then toward Scott. I don't know either," she admitted, "but it's worth commemorating." Luna brightened, took out a palm-sized notebook and a colorful quill, and began to write. "There are so many magical creatures still undiscovered," she said excitedly. "This proves Sorrow Mengs and Crumplehorn Snorkax really exist. Another one was found today, though I didn't see it myself." She scribbled a few lines, then looked up at Scott. "How do you feel? What did they bring you?" Scott swallowed a bite and took a sip of hot cocoa. This afternoon, my brain was invaded by some Sorao Mengs, and my thoughts were a mess, he said. Then another kind of creature showed up. They might be natural enemies of the Sorao Mengs. They drove the Sorao Mengs away, cleared my head, and I was finally able to figure some things out. Savannah's eyes widened in surprise. Luna, eyes shining, wrote quickly, and then shut her notebook with a small, triumphant smile. Congratulations, Scott, she said. This could be a major discovery. As the first person to encounter them, perhaps you could give them a name. I'm terrible at names, Scott said. You should do it. Oh, really? Luna laughed. Then I'll have to think carefully. She fell into deep thought. Scott used the time to finish his meal. By the time his plate was empty, Luna was still pondering. Savannah sat patiently beside her. Finally, Scott, impatient, blurted, "How about brain cleansing, Meng?" Luna looked up, then opened her notebook and wrote the name down. Brain cleansing Meng. Very good. I like that, she said, pleased. Scott felt a little embarrassed, a prickly heat across his scalp. Let's go, he said, rising. You two aren't heading to the Forbidden Forest, are you? Oh, right, Luna snapped out of her reverie and put away her notebook and quill. The house elves, who had already prepared the raw meat, noticed they were about to leave and hurried to present the beef. Do you want to come see it? Luna asked Scott. All right. He was a bit worried about them going into the Forbidden Forest at night, so he decided to accompany them. After leaving the kitchens, Scott, Luna, and Savannah skirted the courtyard, crossed the garden behind the castle, and came to the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Lumos, Scott said. Night had already fallen. The forest beyond the boundary was pitch black. They drew their wands, cast the Lumos charm, and walked in with Scott in the lead. About those stolen thestrals, Luna said softly after a moment, I went to see Professor Trelawney. Scott remembered suggesting to Luna that they consult Trelawney about the missing thestrals. The paper had later revealed their destination, and the matter had been left unresolved. But he hadn't expected Luna to visit the professor. What did she say? He asked. Luna's voice dropped, and she began to imitate Trelawney's odd cadence. I see. My inner eye tells me the answer. Those dark stars will eventually return at the juncture of old and new, and the revived Medea will face a crisis. Her mimicry sounded particularly eerie in the dark hush of the Forbidden Forest. Scott thought of the old tale in the school's histories. When Trelawney truly prophesied, her voice and bearing changed. But Luna's impression wasn't exactly like the professor. He couldn't tell if Luna was copying Trelawney's usual manner or the strange prophetic state. Was she different when she said that? Did her demeanor change? He asked. Different, Luna said after a pause. Her inner eye opened. She spoke with a certainty that surprised him. You really saw it? Yes, Luna answered plainly. Her inner eye isn't under her control, so most of the time she seems a fraud. Scott glanced at her, half incredulous. He knew Luna wasn't one to tell lies, but this was unlike anything he'd seen. He widened his magical awareness to its fullest and then asked, Can you see how far my magic reaches right now? Very far, Luna said, a little uncertainly. Out here in the forest, I can't see where it stops. Scott had to steady himself. Maybe there's something in your eyes, Luna, or some unknown magical creature? Eyes? Oh, I hadn't noticed. Luna's interest lit up. Do you think that's why my eyes stand out? He smiled. I don't know if that changes their shape, but it changes what you see. In some ways, you see more than most people, and in others, you see less. Is that so? I should write to my father about this, Luna said, delighted. Savannah, who had been silent until now, finally spoke in a small, serious voice. Nothing can go into an eye, not even a magical creature. It would damage the eye. Both Scott and Luna turned to her. Savannah's face flushed. She looked like a child who'd accidentally pointed out the Emperor's lack of clothes. Did I say something wrong? She asked, embarrassed. Well, generally that's true, Scott admitted, but perhaps it could be something invisible and intangible. Even he felt the idea was half a guess, but Luna nodded as if it made perfect sense. Savannah's discomfort deepened. Scott quickly changed the subject. Back to Trelawney's prophecy, he said. Those dark stars will eventually return at the juncture of old and new, and the revived Medea will face a crisis. What do you make of it? The juncture of old and new might mean the new year, Savannah offered hurriedly, eager to move past her awkwardness. So the Thestrals would return at New Year? Scott said. I think so, Savannah said. What about you, Luna? The juncture of old and new could be the ministry getting a new minister, Luna answered. Is that an impression? Scott asked. You could say that, Luna replied. My father says fudge won't last long. Mention of the Quibbler's editor made Scott less inclined to treat Luna's remark as solid information. Misdirect. Lovegood's opinions were famously unconventional. Savannah frowned. Most people would think of New Year, she said, baffled by Luna's interpretation. In any case, Scott said, drawing the thread back, the prophecy says the Thestrals will return. You two don't need to worry too much about the foals. Yes, they said together. I hope they come back soon. They all brightened at that. Scott's mind, though, kept circling the last line. The revived Medea will face a crisis. Would it be Dumbledore or Voldemort who brought that crisis upon her? They had nearly reached the Thestrals' grazing ground in the depths of the forest when they saw someone already there, Assistant Professor Grapeland. She stood before the little shed Hagrid had built, tucking a thick blanket over a young Thestral inside. A magical lamp hung overhead, its glow pooling on the mud and the shed's worn wood. Good evening, Miss Grapeland, Scott called as they approached. Hello, everyone, Grapeland answered, turning. She still had a pipe in her mouth, and a thin curl of white smoke blurred her features. Under the lamp's light, her face looked less warm than usual, and for a moment she seemed more remote than the kindly assistant professor they knew. 316, she's just teasing you. When Assistant Professor Grapeland turned, she took the pipe from her mouth, and a bright smile lit her face. Good evening, students, she called, looking straight at Scott and the others. Well, 3 Ravenclaws sneaking into the Forbidden Forest after dark. Remember, even if I'm only a teaching assistant, I can still deduct points. She stepped forward and patted Luna's shoulder, asking softly, how many points do you think I should dock Ravenclaw for this little adventure? Savannah took an instinctive step back, alarmed, while Luna simply looked up at Grapeland without answering. Scott held his wand alight with Lumos and watched more closely. Luna's eyes were unfocused, and her expression vacant. Her thoughts had wandered off. He smiled and said, You can deduct whatever you like, though it would be nice if you were lenient. Grapeland arched an amused brow. You expect me to be lenient, Mr. Trollope? Of course, Scott replied readily. Miss Grapeland is amiable and kind-hearted. Grapeland was in the middle of raising her pipe for a puff when the compliment made her choke. She coughed, then burst into laughter, hand on her hip, laughing heartily until she finally caught her breath. Scott kept smiling, unfazed. You certainly know how to flatter, Mr. Trollope, she said cheerfully, giving him a thumbs up. No wonder you can date 2 lovely girls at once. Savannah shrank back another step. Scott managed a helpless laugh. You're joking, he said. Grapeland walked up and put a hand on his shoulder, leaning in so he could smell sage on her. I'm not joking, she said with a half smile. If I were still at school, I'd be more than willing to date a boy like you. Scott returned the smile. Thank you for the compliment. How boring, she teased, rolling her eyes the moment his expression stayed bland. I thought boys your age would be shyer in a moment like this. She turned and moved to the young Thestral, reaching out to stroke its head. The creature nuzzled her in return with a soft, spoiled sound. You came to see this little one, didn't you? She said fondly. Don't worry, Professor Hagrid and I will take turns looking after it. Luna blinked and seemed to come back from her reverie. Oh, yes, we came to see the little one, she chirped, running forward and pulling a piece of beef wrapped in parchment from her backpack to feed it. The Thestral, clearly familiar with her, rubbed against her hand before devouring the meat. It's growing fast, Grapeland observed, much stronger than it used to be. Luna nodded, dreamy and content. Scott examined the Thestral's thin, bony body and raised an eyebrow, not immediately seeing where the extra strength showed. Savannah joined them, and the 3, 1 adult, 2 students, played with the creature, while Scott stood aside, uninterested in joining. Luna suddenly asked, Miss Grapeland, did you graduate from Ravenclaw? Grapeland laughed and pinched Luna's cheek. Why would you think that? I'm Wilhelmina Grapeland, Gryffindor, class of 1986. Luna covered the pinch with a hand, surprised. I thought so, she murmured, still uncertain. Scott watched Grapeland closely and felt his expression tighten. When he, Luna, and Savannah left the thestral enclosure, Grapeland stayed behind, stroking the animal. "It needs protection," she said quietly. "I worry other creatures might harm it." They retraced their steps out of the forbidden forest. Luna seemed off balance and nearly caught her foot on a root. Scott steadied her arm. "Can't figure it out?" he asked. "She's a Ravenclaw," Luna said in a faraway voice. "Don't overthink it. Maybe she's just teasing you. She is a Gryffindor," Scott said, letting go of her arm. Luna nodded as if that settled the matter and focused on walking. But Scott kept glancing back at the faint light deeper in the forest, uneasy. He wanted to believe Luna, yet the crows that had been keeping watch over Grapeland for some time hadn't reported anything suspicious, so he couldn't draw a firm conclusion. Back at Ravenclaw Tower, chilled to the bone, the three of them sat by the common room fire to warm up. Jacob, hunched over his homework nearby, looked up. "Good evening, Scott, Luna, Savannah." "Good evening." Scott cast a quick glance at the essay sprawled before Jacob. "History of magic?" "Yeah," Jacob muttered. "I keep wondering if Professor Binns ever actually looks at our essays." Scott smiled. "Maybe he just collects them and leaves them there. Ghosts can't handle physical objects, after all, so how would he separate a stack of homework?" Jacob brightened. He seemed livelier than before. Scott noticed that Jacob's magical color had shifted significantly, a change Dumbledore had once mentioned. "Maybe he could get a house elf to help," Scott suggested. "If he did that, Binns would be far too devoted," Jacob said with a shrug, and then turned back to ask Luna and Savannah, "Have you finished yours?" When the room finally grew comfortably warm, Scott returned to the dormitory. Milton was the only other person there. He stood as Scott entered and handed him an envelope. "You've got a letter," he said. "An owl just delivered it." "Thank you." Scott accepted the envelope and glanced at his name on the front. The handwriting was unfamiliar. He moved to the single armchair by the window and sat, turning the envelope over in his hand. There were no telltale magical ripples, but after William's letter, he had grown cautious about mail from unknown sources. He didn't open it blindly. "What's wrong?" Milton asked, curious. "Why aren't you opening it?" Scott shook the envelope with a smile. "It's from a stranger. I don't recognize the handwriting." "So?" Milton frowned. Scott held the envelope at arm's length, expression unreadable. "I can't open it rashly. There could be a harmful curse or poison inside." Milton laughed. "Fine, open it and show us." Scott stood, set the envelope on the stool by his bed, and sat again in the armchair. "No, I need an animal to open it." He flicked his wand under Milton's bewildered stare. Transfiguration light flashed, and the stool became a small monkey. The monkey chattered, grabbed the letter from the top of its head, and tore into it roughly. Bang! When the envelope opened, yellow powder exploded into a cloud of smoke that fanned out across the room. The monkey screamed and clutched at its skin. Scott leapt up to stand between Milton and the spreading dust and shouted, "Protego!" An invisible shield sprang up, holding the yellow smoke back. "Wind sweeping," Scott added. A sudden gust gathered the powder into a swirling ball. Only then did they see the monkey properly. It was writhing and crying, its skin and fur blistered and bubbled grotesquely. "Are you all right?" Milton blurted. "I'm fine." Scott opened the window and cast another spell. The whirlwind carried the yellow powder outside. He then turned the monkey back into the stool. Milton jumped up and inspected it. The stool's paint had bubbled and blistered as if burned by acid. "It really was poison," Milton said, stunned. Scott picked up the now empty envelope. The parchment it had held lay unfolded on the floor. He tapped his wand, and the sheet rose into the air, fluttering. Both of them kept their distance. The handwriting on the parchment was wild and slanted, as if from someone unhinged. "Ha! This is retribution, you executioner. I hope you like this present. I will not let you live. You killed her. If not for you, she would still be alive. You will pay. Mudblood, I will make you pay." The rest of the letter was a frantic string of hateful curses. Milton's eyes widened. What is this?" he asked, his face draining of color. "Who would?" Scott's eyes narrowed. With a quick flick he cast Incendio. Flames leapt from his wand and consumed the letter and the envelope. When the parchment and paper were ash, he used wind sweeping again to blow the ashes out the window. "You burned the evidence," Milton cried. "We should take this to Professor Flitwick and hand it over to an auror at the ministry." No need. Scott sank back into the armchair. Do you already know who wrote it? Milton asked, uneasy. Scott nodded. I have a guess. Who? Milton pressed. You should have at least kept it so the Aurors could arrest them. It'd be useless. Even with the letter, they wouldn't catch the person, Scott said. Why? Milton demanded. Think about the content, Scott said. The hatred is personal. The writer accuses me of killing a woman. Who would have motive and think that way? Milton's face tightened as he realized what Scott meant. You mean Jasmine Travers? Scott nodded. Who else? Travers left St. Mungo's to go after me. That's ridiculous. Travers wanted trouble, yes, but her death was an accident, an accidental dismemberment. Milton snapped. She didn't die because of you. I know, Scott said quietly, but who would blame me and want revenge like this? Her relatives, Milton guessed. There are no Travers left, and they wouldn't use something so melodramatic. Scott looked at Milton. If I'm right, the letter's from Caitlin Roll. At the name, Milton's eyes widened. The girl who threw herself down the stairs to frame Jacob. Scott nodded. Her cousin, Elijah Caro, attacked me twice. He was later expelled. Are you sure? Milton asked again. Why her, now, after a year? Scott told him what Caro had said, that he'd attacked because Caitlin hated Scott and refused to return to Hogwarts. Scott intuited that Caitlin, who had long been manipulated, no, controlled, by the Travers family's inherited magic, had only now begun to act on that hatred. It seemed late, but not impossible. Then tell the Aurors, Milton insisted, and Professor Flitwick, quickly. It's pointless, Scott said. They've already left for Durmstrang. Milton froze. Durmstrang? He frowned. You checked? Yeah, they transferred to another school, Scott said with a bitter smile. British Aurors can't reach that place. They'll come back, maybe at Christmas. Anyway, that letter was illegal, Milton said. Illegal, Scott repeated softly. So what? Do you remember when Caro and an adult wizard ambushed me in the Forbidden Forest? Dumbledore had that adult sent to the Ministry. Caro was locked in the Ministry dungeon for a while, then released. Even if the Aurors investigated, they wouldn't be able to pin this on Caitlin now that she's out of the country. Milton glared. Then what are you going to do? They didn't get to argue long. The dormitory door swung open, and Roger and Eddie came in together. We're back! Evening, what happened? Roger asked, noticing the tense air immediately. Once the door was closed, Milton hurriedly told them everything that had just occurred. In the dormitory, listening to Milton's account, Roger and Eddie grew more serious. The three of them walked over to Scott's bed and stared at the stool whose paint had been eaten away by the poison. Roger looked at Scott and said, Milton and I talked this over. I think you should tell the professor. What kind of poison is this? Eddie grimaced. It ate through wood like it was nothing. Imagine what it would do to skin. Who can say? Scott admitted. It was a yellow powder that bursts into smoke when it hits the air and spreads fast. Milton still looked shaken. If you hadn't been expecting it and opened the letter yourself, his face went pale. Scott, what are you thinking? Are you just going to let this go? Roger pressed. Scott smiled. Of course I'm not going to let it go, but I don't see much point in telling the professor or taking it straight to the Ministry of Magic. Oh, you don't think the Ministry can handle this properly? Eddie snorted. Do you want to take revenge yourself? I wouldn't put it past you. Well, do you have any good ideas? Scott asked mildly. I don't have anything brilliant, Eddie said. You could write back and add the same sort of ingredients and send it to her. No, Milton objected immediately. Eddie raised an eyebrow. What, you feeling sorry for her now? Not at all, Milton frowned. Your idea is to hand the whole thing over to someone else. The Ministry might be unfair to you, Scott, but it won't be unfair to someone like Roll. She's pure blood, born into a good family. As long as they don't trace it to us, Eddie countered. Roger scowled. Do they need evidence? Roll knows what she did. If she's the one who sent it, she'll slip up. We can be careful and leave no trace, Eddie said, unless Roll confesses first. Pure-blood families don't always need evidence, Milton said sourly. They can get away with a lot. Milton still shook his head. And if confessing first risks convicting Scott, Roll would do it without a second thought. You haven't seen that letter. She was probably already unhinged. So what then? We really just let it go? Eddie demanded. Tell the professor and notify the Ministry. Milton said, looking at Scott with sudden resolution. At least it might make Roll hold back a bit. I can ask my father for help. He's just a lowly clerk, but if he gets Mrs. Zabini involved, maybe they can make sure Roll gets what she deserves. My dad has contacts at the ministry, too, Roger added. Sorry. Eddie shrugged. I can't help with this. Scott's smile widened. He could see how genuinely his roommates wanted to help and felt a small warmth at that. I'm glad you're willing, he said, but it won't be necessary. Don't drag Mr. Greaves or Mr. Davis into this. Milton and Roger started to protest, but Scott stopped them. No more talk. I'll handle it myself. His tone shut the conversation down. And how are you going to do that? Eddie asked, curiosity getting the better of him. Scott's smile turned slightly mysterious. Some things are better known by as few people as possible. Despite Eddie's persistent prodding, Scott refused to say more. Milton and Roger weren't as insistent. They only warned Scott to be careful and not let the other side catch on. Scott agreed. He already had ideas. The cousins Carol and Roll had crossed him, and Scott wasn't the sort to accept an injury without response. His counterattack wouldn't be aimed only at Carol or Roll. It would target the emotional strings that bound them. He would need time to prepare. After a shower, Scott took out his ancient runes notes and sat on the bed to study. Eddie couldn't help creeping closer, still unsatisfied, and peeked at the notebook. Scott simply smiled and let him look. This is ancient runes? Eddie said, disappointed. I thought you were planning revenge. Why are you studying? Scott glanced at his anxious roommate and wanted to reply with a proverb about not rushing an emperor, but there was no one to appreciate it, so he let it go. He certainly didn't tell Eddie that the rune patterns he was poring over were the very method he intended to use. The design was a confusing sequence of runes, based on the letter William had once sent him. With Ravenclaw's help, Scott had discovered the trick hidden in that letter, and under Ravenclaw's guidance, had learned the rune sequence. Ravenclaw had then optimized the pattern. Unlike the crude runes hidden in William's note, which took immediate and obvious effect, the improved sequence didn't work in an instant. Instead, it subtly engraved an idea into a person's mind. Over time, that idea would deepen and take root. Once ingrained, it would be difficult to dislodge. Scott's plan was to find a way to send Carol a gift she couldn't resist and conceal the rune pattern within it, gently nudging a thought into her until it bloomed. There was one crucial constraint. The implanted idea couldn't be brazen. It had to build on something already in Carol's mind, strengthen or twist an existing thought so the change would be untraceable. Scott planned to exploit the emotional tangle between Carol and Roll, the cousins who were also engaged. Carol might be willing to attack Scott because of her feelings for her fiancé. Roll was different. That girl's heart and eyes were full of the late Miss Travers. Scott intended to steer those affections into something ugly. He had in mind a slow, deliberate transformation, to turn an adoring, submissive attachment into scorn, a drama of the fawning dog turning black. 319. Mission, true or false, confrontation. 2 things, Scott told Lambo in the Forbidden Forest. First, find out Elijah Caro's preferences. Second, bring me something imbued with his magic. Lambo perched on a branch, listening at first, then flapped its wings and squawked. You're making it hard for Lambo. Scott smiled. I believe in you. You can do it. No, I can't, Lambo snapped. Then you teach me how. Scott hesitated. Wait until the Christmas holidays. If Caro returns to Britain then, things will be easier. What if he doesn't come back? Lambo asked. Then we'll go to Durmstrang, Scott said. Or we can wait until next year. It's almost New Year, Lambo grumbled. For now, find the Caro family's location the old way, Scott instructed. Understood? Being Scott's transfigured creation, Lambo couldn't truly refuse and reluctantly accepted. Watching the raven fly off, Scott allowed himself a relieved smile. Lambo was already a mature raven. Over time, it would become smarter and more human-like, able to handle tougher tasks. Could a transfigured creature grow like that? He hadn't expected it. Later, he figured it had everything to do with that one-time Philosopher's Stone. Only such a treasure could give a Transfiguration creation such far-reaching potential. The thought made him covet the Chamber of Secrets again. Maybe there was a way to make a one-time Philosopher's Stone inside. He suppressed the greed. The odds were low, and he had no intention of breaking into the chamber rashly. Even if he could force the door, he couldn't be sure Medea hadn't left contingencies inside. After all, there was a portrait of Medea from her youth in the chamber, and she still had a special key that had let her evade Dumbledore once. Who knew whether she could return instantly through that key? It wasn't worth the risk. Scott undid the charm he had set and started to leave the Forbidden Forest. He stopped when he saw Professor Groppeland emerging from the trees. When she drew near, he greeted her. "Hello, Miss Groppeland." "Hello," she smiled kindly. "We meet again, boy. May I call you Scott?" "Of course," he answered. She exhaled a puff of white smoke, the corners of her mouth turning up and two deep dimples appearing in her round face. "You can call me Wilhelmina." They walked out of the Forbidden Forest together. Groppeland wiped mud from her long boots on the grass. Scott had no desire to linger in conversation, so he prepared to leave, but she teased, "Last night and now, this is the second time I've caught you sneaking into the Forbidden Forest in a short span, Scott." He cut to the point. "And thank you for not taking points from me, Wilhelmina." She glanced at him, smiling. "I won't ask what you were doing in the forest. Everyone has their own secrets." She shook the pipe in her hand. "By the way, remind those two Ravenclaw girls that if they want to go into the forest to see that little fellow, they should come to me first. I'll take them." "I'll tell them," Scott said, waving. "Goodbye, Wilhelmina." He walked away without looking back. In his perception, she stayed where she stood, watching him go. Scott was certain this assistant professor had secrets. She probably wasn't the real Wilhelmina Groppeland. The real Groppeland, he had confirmed, had graduated from Gryffindor. This woman gave him a Ravenclaw feel. That impression had come not only from Luna's intuition, but from Scott's own sense of her magic. Though the assistant professor had not yet shown any overt signs of danger, Scott kept the Raven's surveillance on her tight at his request. She had been recruited by Dumbledore. Perhaps this was the headmaster's arrangement. He decided to find an opportunity to raise the matter with Dumbledore whenever they met, rather than actively seek him out. Back inside the castle, Scott stopped again. Around the corner, Harry, Ron, and Neville were facing Malfoy and his gang. "The trial's already started," Malfoy sneered. "Just wait, Potter. Hagrid will be expelled soon." "He might even get Azkaban," Parkinson chimed in. "That beast will probably be sentenced to death," Malfoy said with cruel satisfaction. "You'll have 2 fewer friends at Hogwarts, Potter. You'll cry then." His cronies laughed. Harry shot back, furious. "Shut up, Malfoy. Your father won't get his way. Hagrid won't be expelled, and Buckbeak won't be executed." "That's not up to you, Potter," Malfoy replied smugly. "Just wait and see." "Let's go, Harry." "Ignore him. We know Dumbledore runs this school," Ron said. "The Ministry isn't run by Dumbledore, Weasley," Malfoy retorted with a sneer. "And it certainly isn't run by your poor old dad. He's got no power there." "You bastard," Ron snapped, lunging, only to be held back by Harry. Malfoy and his cronies strutted past, lowering their heads when they saw Scott standing there and hurrying by. Harry spotted Scott and ran over. "Hey, Scott, Hagrid's trial started today. Did you know?" Scott shook his head. "Sorry, I didn't know it was today." Harry looked anxious. "Do you think we can help Hagrid win this trial?" Facing Harry's question, Scott could only say, "Hagrid should be all right." As for Buckbeak, the hippogriff probably wouldn't be acquitted. Otherwise, would Lucius Malfoy have gone to all that trouble for nothing? Scott didn't think the cunning Malfoy would be so useless. He hadn't followed the case closely lately, so he couldn't be certain. Harry's face darkened when he understood Scott's meaning. "So Buckbeak might really be executed?" "Malfoy started this." Scott shrugged. "Whatever the cause, Buckbeak did injure someone. Compared to a wizard, the Wizengamot judges animals far more harshly." He flicked a connection to the small Harry doll hanging from Harry's backpack and began listening to its report. "Is there really nothing we can do?" Ron asked, frowning. Scott listened to the report and answered at the same time. "I don't know. It depends on whether William can come up with something." "I really hope William can get Buckbeak off," Ron said. "If not, Malfoy's going to be unbearably smug." He screwed up his face, picturing Malfoy's self-satisfied expression. Harry clenched his fists. "For now, we can only wait," he said. "That's all we can do." Ron's shoulders sank, then he suddenly lowered his voice. Seriously, do you think Hagrid's just unlucky? I mean, he's always unlucky. What do you mean? Harry asked. The magical creatures he keeps always get into trouble, Ron said mysteriously. Last year, all those acromantula in the Forbidden Forest were killed. This year, some thestrals were stolen, and now Buckbeak might be in danger. Harry went pale. This can't be Hagrid's bad luck, can it? He said weakly. I think it is, Ron said like it was settled fact. The two stared at each other for a few seconds. Then Harry sounded panicked. What do we do? Is there any way to change Hagrid's luck? Scott's mouth twitched. He'd been wondering the same. Neville ventured, uncertainly. Felix Felicis? What's that? Harry asked, puzzled. A potion, liquid luck, Neville said. They say drinking it brings you good luck. Harry's eyes widened. There's a potion like that? He looked at Scott. Is it real? There is, Scott confirmed. You can buy it. Where? Harry was eager. I feel like I could use some luck. Scott smiled. Potions are temporary. Felix Felicis doesn't give you real lasting luck. Not real luck, it just makes you feel lucky? Harry's interest faded. Ron and Neville looked disappointed. Scott explained, Felix Felicis temporarily sharpens everything. Magical skill, reflexes, judgment. That's why it's called liquid luck. When you take it, everything seems to go your way, but it's extremely expensive to make and the brewing is complicated. It takes half a year. Overuse causes dizziness, recklessness, arrogance. That effectively broke their fascination. So it can't cure Hagrid's bad luck, Harry said, disappointed, as if he'd already accepted Ron's superstition. By then, the hairy doll had finished its report, and Scott had learned something else important. Harry had dreamed about Lord Voldemort the previous night. The boy who lived had mentioned it only briefly to Ron and hadn't told Hermione. Scott, meanwhile, kept one hand on Harry's forehead and quietly sensed the scar. If Voldemort's soul fragment inside Harry wasn't active now, Scott could only detect a faint foreign magic there. It was very weak. He understood that as Voldemort's main body grew stronger, the fragment's influence on Harry would increase. Since Harry wasn't a true Horcrux, the piece of Voldemort's soul lodged in him would, as the Dark Lord's main soul recovered, instinctively try to leave Harry and return. That urge is what, in the original timeline, caused Harry's headaches when Voldemort returned. Scott couldn't draw anything more definite, and he didn't want to ask Harry directly. He said goodbye to Harry, Ron, and Neville and headed back to Ravenclaw Tower. He found Luna and Savannah in the common room and relayed Grapeland's message to them. Find her first? Luna repeated, surprised. Do we really have to? I'm just passing the message along, Scott said. How you handle it is up to you. Luna studied him for a moment. What's your advice, Scott? Scott sat on the sofa opposite them. I suggest you don't go into the Forbidden Forest. Then we won't go, Luna said simply. Savannah agreed with a nod. Scott was a little surprised. Luna didn't strike him as someone who would obey on a whim. Luna didn't notice his scrutiny. She went back to casually flipping through the book in her hands. Scott asked straight out, Why did you decide not to go just because I said so? You must have a reason, Savannah said. I think it's better to follow your suggestion. Perhaps because they'd grown a bit closer again, Savannah seemed more at ease. Luna looked up from her reading. We weren't planning on going back anyway, she said. That little fellow is almost tame now. Her? Scott said, surprised. Grapeland? Not Hagrid. Luna nodded. She'll take good care of it. Then she bent her head and resumed reading. Scott turned to Savannah. He thought druids might be able to talk to animals, but Savannah shook her head with a puzzled expression.